Hello, 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 coaches and leaders. I have two fantastic authors that are super knowledgeable, and I know I'm going to learn a ton in this conversation. We are going to be talking about their book, Doing the Work of Equity Leadership for Justice and Systems Change. I am so excited to have Dr. Ann Ishimaru and Dr. Decoteau Irby on the show. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Becca.
Yeah,
Excited to
I'm
be here.
excited. Yeah, I'm excited to just have this conversation about your new book. And before we jump into the content that actually feels very relevant right now, I would love you to just share with folks, where do you live and what do you do in the world?
I can get started. So again, Becca, thanks so much for having us on your podcast. My name is Decoteau Irby. I'm a father. I'm a musician. I'm an author. I'm also a professor at University of Illinois, Chicago. I teach in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and work primarily to prepare school leaders
Mhm.
for Chicago and Chicago area leadership. Um, Yeah, I'm a father. I live on the south side of Chicago. I
Mhm.
spend a lot of weekends on at baseball diamonds. My son is finally joined the travel baseball team, and I spend a lot of time with my daughter doing theater related things, helping her memorize lines and that sort of thing. So that's a little bit about me.
Love it.
And I am coming from the lands of the Duwamish in Seattle, Washington. I'm also a mom. I have three kids and am also an author, researcher, and I'm a professor at the University of Washington in the College of Education in our Educational Foundations Leadership and Policy Department. And I do research on leadership, but I think about that really broadly. So it isn't about any one single role. I do prepare. Leaders both for schools and for systems in the state of Washington, but I also think about what is the role of young people, families, and communities as well in leadership and in leading change in schools and school systems? And like Dakota, you can find me often on the sidelines of sports activities. I've got kids who play soccer and ultimate frisbee. And yeah, as we go into the fall in the Pacific Northwest, I'm not actually very excited about all of the rain and the cold that's coming, but I know
It's
it's part of the
coming.
deal.
Yeah, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we are entering this beautiful fall season where it's like just starting to get crisp and cool, and I'm enjoying it. So
Oh,
we have
lovely.
the nice temperate. We're like a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and not too extreme
Yeah,
of anything.
lovely.
All right, so we're gonna jump in here. My first question for both of you is, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, we look back around, well, actually, let me start with what actually got us started in doing this work.
Hmm.
We were sitting with a colleague, Terrence Green, at a convening in Minneapolis, and we were having lunch. And we were just chatting about like there are these equity director roles that are coming up. And I thought, oh, I thought it was just in my part of the country. And it turns out, oh no, each of us knew colleagues or friends who were entering into these roles, and we started to wonder, like, well, what what are these roles? What are they doing? How is that working? And so we said, well, let's like surely someone studied this, right? So we thought, let's go look at the literature. And no one had studied it. And, there have been these kinds of roles in higher education. And so we thought, oh, well, maybe we can just build from that. And it turns out, K-12 is quite distinct from higher education. And so that kind of started this nearly decade of work with not only Terrence Green, but also a number of other both junior scholars, other scholars in the field, and then also practitioners who became co-authors in this book to really understand what it means to do equity leadership in schools and systems. And we moved after the first phase from these roles, people in these individual roles, into thinking about what does it mean for it to spread across the system, and to not be only about people in a particular role, but to think about leadership and the folks who are taking leadership for making change in schools across multiple different roles.
Yeah,
What
this
would you
is
add to that,
incredible.
Dakota?
What, yeah, no, what an interesting kind of beginning of all this. I don't know, Dakota, if you want to share any more about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ann kind of captured the initial, reasons that we became interested in, what we now call like equity leadership. And I think the thing that I would add is that when we started thinking about the book, we wanted to really write something to kind of really help people understand, and have kind of like a kind of core text for people to really understand, even amongst themselves, what this equity leadership activities and practices actually entail.
Yeah.
We learned that it's about disaggregating and looking at data in particular ways. It's
Mhm.
about engaging student voice in particular ways. It's also about professional development.
Yes.
All of these different sorts of things that folks were doing. And in our first study, we identified a range of different kind of practices. And then we were funded to do more in-depth case studies of select districts. And
Hmm.
we followed those districts over 3 years to really understand how equity leadership looked in these different contexts.
Hmm.
And so the book basically is a culmination of everything that we've learned since we, got curious during that initial lunch conversation in Minneapolis.
So fascinating. And when was this? When did this conversation start? Like what year?
It's
It was
2016, I believe.
2016.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Wow.
2016. And
Yeah,
some
this
of it,
is,
yeah,
yeah.
some of it was we were in this period and we go back to you know, the Million Hoodie movement, Trayvon
Mhm.
Martin,
Mhm.
uh, Barack Obama, and how
Mhm.
the climate at that particular time created the conditions where these roles started to emerge. And then in 2020, um, with the racial uprisings, with the COVID pandemic, the way that communities of color, children of color were experiencing that particular moment, we saw a massive proliferation of equity leadership activities
Mhm.
and the creation of more people to actually formally engage in these kinds of activities in districts.
Mhm.
So that's what the book is about, and we hope that our contribution to the field and to practitioners will be increasing people's understanding of what the leadership of equity leadership actually entails.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating. So that I feel like you led us to the first thing I wanted to talk about, which was you use this analogy of looking at the different, is it, I don't know if phases is the right word of equity leadership, where you talk about there's morning, midday, evening, and night, and these different phases. And I would love you to share what that describes and what that means and where we are now in all of that.
Yeah. So, if you look at the cover of the book, you'll see that we have this kind of image of the sun and the sky, and then you've got clouds, and it starts to get dark, right? And so the kind of eras that Dakota was talking about really correspond to those. That there's different. The broader argument, right, is we always say that context matters in leadership, right? That
Mhm.
sounds. It's almost like this truism everyone says, but it's like, what does that mean?
Mhm.
And how do we think about that? So we can think about that in terms of the specifics of what's happened in a given school or district or community. But I think we also can think about that across time as we have different eras. And that morning time after the kind of awakening in 2000, say 13, 14, um, meant that there were certain kinds of work that equity leaders were doing that was kind of we always kind of say, like in the beginning there were, equity new roles, there were new policies, there were equity audits, and that's kind of what was going on in the morning times. The midday times, it was really about institutionalizing and expanding the equity activity. That's when we were seeing a lot of professional development and building the capacity of other educators. And then now we're in, night is falling. So very quickly, the pushback started, the anti-CRT, the book bans, and now we have federal mandates, anti-DEI mandates. And so as we've been concluding this book, literally, I was writing the conclusion on inauguration day and thinking about how do we think about this work over the past nearly 10 years as night has begun to fall.
Yeah.
And so that is really where we are now as we're thinking about what are the lessons? What do you do at night, right? You think back about the lessons of the day.
Mhm.
You may need to strategize for a new day coming. And I like to say, I guess this is an old-fashioned saying, but like we might spell each other out. So it might be a time when we need to think strategically about who is in the forefront, and who is resting while that's happening so that we can keep going because it's gonna be a long night. And also recognizing that from historical examples, the Underground Railroad happened at night under cover of dark. So there's going to be some places where they're going to be kind of beacons of light, and we're going to keep going. Our colleague, Dr. Terrence Green, has a new book coming out, and the first part of the title is Still Committed. There are folks who are, we have to keep going. We have to still do the work, but the given the context in a particular state or a particular location is going to be very different. So some of those places, folks are going to be, that kind of beacon of light and continue to do the work in very visible, explicit kinds of ways. And other places, it's going to have to go under cover of dark, but we keep it
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would add is that, we saw a lot of people in this period that we call evening doing things like being very intentional about connecting with like-minded folks,
Mhm.
studying together,
Mhm.
reading together, forming communities that oftentimes were outside of the kind of like formal structure.
Mhm.
And so for example, in one of our chapters, the authors write about this group of women principals who kind of grew unsatisfied with the pace of change that the district was pursuing and started to kind of do their own thing. They started to meet together. They had, the text message thread and the group chats. They supported one another to figure out how to address issues that were happening in their school. And so I think, the point that Anne is making, especially with this idea about like being underground, is that people are still going to continue to lift up and do a lot of the practices and focus on the students who need the most supports to actually, and really are reliant on education for, having a better life, for upward mobility, for graduation, for college enrollment, right? There's a set of students who really have substantial needs. And so people are still doing that work. They're also working across districts, not only within districts.
Mhm.
One of the chapters in the book focuses on a kind of like network of folks who started to come together. So we're starting to see people who are committed to equity leadership practices forming their own kind of like communities. And I think a lot of what we're seeing people as we go into the night is that there's people strategizing, reading, studying, learning lessons from the past while also continuing to do their work. So I'm hopeful. The thing about the metaphor that we use is that the morning is going to come back around, right?
Yeah.
And so when that morning comes back around, we're going to have um, the lessons learned, the
Uh-huh.
resources, many of the practices, hopefully many of the mindsets
Mhm.
that will be able to kind of pick up where things kind of left off, and people will be able to do the work in what I hope will be even more powerful and profound ways than what we've even seen before.
This is the most hopeful conversation I've had about this topic in a long time. So one, we haven't even dug into much, but it's like I really love your framing around we're not stuck here forever, right? It's not doom and gloom. This is the stage that we're in, and it's a cycle, right?
Mhm.
It will shift. We're not stuck. It will move. I would love to hear if you have examples off the top of your head around. I'd love to hear examples of what kind of before this current administration came in to the government, what kind of equity leadership practices looked like, being able to be explicit about it. And then how has it shifted? How have people figured out how to have these leadership practices happen in during this night when we can't call it that, right? These underground practices. What did it look like before, almost a before and after? I'm personally interested in. I don't know if you have examples offhand of that.
Do you want to give that a go, Anne, or do you want me to?
Um, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
so I'll say right now is that the things that are captured in the book are the things that were happening before. We collected this data,
Yeah, yeah.
so we have like anecdotal
Yeah.
information about, what's happening now. So these aren't things that are covered in the book. I think it depends on where you're talking about, and
Uh-huh.
people's reactions differ depending on where you are. For example, you're in North Carolina. There were folks in North Carolina who, even before this current administration came in, were having to change kind of what they were talking about and what they were doing. So, some of it meant, shifting the language from, equity to belonging.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it also meant that some people would shift to like, we're going to focus on SEL, but we're going to focus on this group of students. I think there's also some some consequences of doing that, right? Because I mean, one of the things that we've seen is that the folks who want to attack, really what we're talking about is leadership practices and approaches to education that benefit students that have historically been left out of educational opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
That's really at the core of what we're talking about. And so one of the challenges is that even when you change that language, it still gets attacked. The core of the work oftentimes still gets attacked. But
Mm-hmm.
the beautiful thing is that we also know that people were doing a lot of things to help those same children, those same students, before we started calling it equity leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So when we first started our study, Anne talked about this a little bit earlier on, like we focused on the roles.
Uh-huh.
And so this was the first time we saw the emergence, like the formal investment that districts made in, specific roles, specific leadership positions, specific kinds of professional development and learning focused on a topic. However, that doesn't mean that people weren't doing the work of equity leadership before. We just didn't name it that way and it wasn't resourced in the same way. And so a lot of the things from, parents, teachers choosing what they read, coaches really helping folks focus on the students who are going to be the most at need.
Mm-hmm.
There's offices and departments of student support services across the country, and the student support services, especially when we start to think about like students who have special needs, Title I officers, those are the people who are actually doing a lot of the work of equity leadership, but it didn't have
Uh-huh.
like the formal title and we weren't calling it that at that time. So I think that a lot of the blueprints are there. Like follow your Title I folks, follow what the advisors and the leaders were doing to support the LGBTQIA Alliance. Follow the folks who were focusing on Black Student Union. So if you follow all of these kinds of folks who were engaged in these kinds of activities, even before the era that we write about, it gives you a sense of what people can actually just keep doing because they were doing it before.
Mm-hmm.
It got some light in the morning, and especially in the midday.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that people can't. Well, book bans make it more difficult, right? There's specific bans. So it is more difficult, but
Yeah.
I found that many people are still committed to continuing to do a lot of the things to support the students that historically haven't been supported.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just kind of, as Dakota, part of what he's narrating, I think that we saw folks do in the earlier times, like Letitia Reed wrote a chapter about the about kind of trying to change the district policy around LGBTQ inclusion and not gender non-specific. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, the bathrooms, and one of the things that she really talks about is kind of reaching out to the different community organizations that have been doing this work and are continuing to do this work. And I think even like North Carolina, you think they're like I want to shout out Village of Wisdom is one of the partners that we've been working with in a different project, and it's really thinking about Black families, Black parents in that context, and they're the experts on what their children need and will continue to be advocating and moving and partnering and collaborating with systems to ensure that their children are enabled to thrive. And so I think that that's it's kind of like if there's one piece of advice that I would give to educators right now, it would be find your people, find the people who are already doing this work. It's often Black women at the forefront. Every one of the chapters in the beginning of the book are there's a vignette and it's a Black woman sharing some of the experiences that they've encountered in their leadership. So really trying to not kind of go it alone, but to look around and say, okay, there are folks who were doing this work prior to, the lights coming on and all the resources. And there are folks who are continuing to do that work even as night has fallen.
Mm-hmm. I would love to ask you, I want to kind of zoom in on some concrete strategies, right? People can think through if listeners are coming from all different places. Some folks are like, we've been doing this work and we want to continue, and I'm interested in this conversation. Some folks are like, I'm not sure. I want to do something, right? In the like
Mhm.
almost the like we haven't done much before, but we want to do something now. I want to talk to the folks that are kind of in the middle, like have done some equity work, are now interested in doing more in this political climate. What are some and I know I'm talking very generically, and different school districts are different within a region, within a state. I know I work with them, they all are wildly different. So I don't know if there's a way for you to just name those folks have done some work, right? It's not like beginning, like, hey, there's this thing called
Yeah.
equity,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, Somewhere in the middle, do you have like maybe two or three concrete things people can analyze, look at, do that is
Yeah.
like highly impactful?
Yeah. So one of them, well, I have two, and I hope I'm not going to take yours. And one is to pay attention, pay careful attention to data,
Okay.
especially formative data, because
Mm.
there's a story in the data about the students that if provided with the right resources and support, actually improve the performance of entire districts and schools. So I think that there's, you know, the way that the language has emerged in the last, decade or so has been like this idea of targeted universalism. If you focus on these students that have specific needs, whether that's Black males, whether it's indigenous students, whether it's students with IEPs, if you can focus intensely on them, it actually improves the instruction and the schooling experiences for all students, right? And we know from the research that a lot of times there's this idea that if these students are getting this particular, if they're getting additional supports that somebody else is losing, and it's not the research doesn't bear out that it's a zero sum game in that way. So that's one thing I would do is stay focused. And even if, for example, and so let the data lead to the student populations that would benefit from the most resources and support. The other part of that is thinking about how we treat those students. So it's not just focusing on the students, it's also how we treat those students. And the way to understand how to treat students is to listen to the students and their families. The families, I even experience this about, I can tell you how to support my children. I can do a pretty good job. I can't tell you 100% because I'm not there. So I don't know everything, but I
Yeah.
can tell you quite a bit. And we got to be partners in this thing. So I think part of it is to help coaches, instructional leaders to help teachers as well as their colleagues be very intentional about seeking out the voices, the perspectives of students and of parents. And there's as far as like that, I don't know how you can legislate not talking to students and parents. So we should be good to go, even in this
Yeah.
political climate with that, right? Like just
Exactly. Yeah.
talk to people, get feedback. This is very concrete in terms of even like at the beginning of the year, I can kind of tell how the school year is going to go. Depending on whether a teacher sends home one of those, like, let me get to know your student. That's not,
Yeah.
like sheets.
Yeah.
They don't send that. I
Hmm.
can be like, look, I got to pay more attention, right? And so I think those kind of things to understand the strengths of students, to understand the pain points of students and families, and being willing to be responsive and reactive to those things are like very concrete things. And part of that, when I say paying attention to the data, is also paying attention to student voices as a form of data, and their stories as a form of data, and their past experiences in schools as a form of data that you pay close attention to. So that note shouldn't just come home at the beginning of the year. You should also be checking in on a regular basis to see how are things going. So though that student voice and that parent involvement and voice is important in addition to, the more kind of traditional assessments that folks are actually looking at to adjust instruction and to guide their school improvement efforts.
That's really fantastic. And
Of course, mine overlap with those. But I guess I'll push the student voice one even more because I think that we sometimes have this idea of like um a number of districts have taken up this idea of student voice as a form of data, which I think is really important and really vital. And sort of like trying to think about what does it mean for for young people themselves to be part of identifying what are the solutions, what are the changes, how does that impact instruction? So like if we take that sort of formative assessment even farther, like thinking about like everyday measures, so like there's a kind of practical measurement thing out there, and it sounds really esoteric, but it really is kind of like at the end of a class, are there one or two questions you could ask young people about their experience of their learning, and then not stop there. I think a lot of times there's like, okay, I'm going to collect that data. Now I'm going to just decide what to do with it. But it could also be working with them to think about, okay, if we were talking about the context of instruction, how could it be different? How could we change it? What would make it more engaging or more relevant? And having sometimes those are maybe a practical measure like that, or it's just having a conversation and opening space for young people to be part of the decisions about how change can unfold. And so that becomes really powerful when you think about, even if it's data and we're looking at more conventional kinds of data, where are the spaces and places where young people or families can be part of the conversation? And there's some terrific routines out there too, even just of young people um, having conversations and collecting this qualitative data with their classmates and then bringing it back and synthesizing it with the teacher. And then they're part of a conversation about like how they could improve instruction. And so, say, instructional coaches could be really vital in helping to facilitate those kinds of processes because as an individual teacher, it's very difficult to kind of manage all the different pieces. But instructional coaches are particularly focused on how do we collect that data? How do we make sense of things? And how do we then think about changes to the practices that are happening it could be at the classroom level, it could be at the school level, but really thinking about how to create and hold spaces for the experiences of young people to help us think about how to improve what's happening in the classroom, in schools, or in a district.
Yeah. Okay, this led me actually, that was such a beautiful, and that was such a beautiful segue because my final question for you is I'm thinking about the adult level now, right? So we talked a lot about how to bring equity to children. School leaders, school coaches, and leaders to support teachers, right? We know school culture starts with the adults, period, right?
Mhm.
We can't
Yeah.
skip over teachers and just talk to children. So my question is, where have you found, or what strategies, what actions have you seen school leaders and coaches do that support building a culture of equity in schools when interacting with teachers?
Yeah, we have there's a chapter by one of our colleagues, Dr. Teresa Lance, who writes about this very beautifully. One I would say is that it takes time.
Hmm.
She actually started to form kind of a district-wide committee that was composed of leaders from multiple different schools. And really what she realized is that the important role that she played was creating the structure and routines, right? So that how the time that people spent together was actually managed and run was very important. So she had routines where they were always looking at data. They always had their pillars and things that they were focused on at the very top of their agendas. Um, and so she basically started to build the capacity of people to look at things and think a certain way. And she knew exactly. She was like, I know that I'm succeeding when people start to look at what I put in front of them the way that I would look at it
Oh
and that
yeah.
sort of thing. So she really created a lot of really cool structure, which I don't, it's kind of detailed, but I encourage people to read the chapter by Dr. Teresa Lance. And I think the title of it is like Institutionalizing Equity. I can't remember the exact name. But it's a really good example because what I always remind leaders about is that leaders' power is an ability to create the conditions for learning. And so creating the kinds of conditions for adults to learn is like the most important thing that leaders can do. How I describe it when I teach in my instructional leadership course is that, and this is specifically for people who are going to be principals, I say you're not just a principal, you're the principal teacher. Your job is to treat the adults around you like there are students and that you're going to be the person who's going to be facilitating their learning. So if you do that, then in the same way that teachers spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to create the learning conditions that are powerful in their rooms, they put up the standards, they put up the unit, they put up the object, they put those things up. Leaders should be thinking about when they bring people together for learning purposes, doing the same things that good teachers do.
Yeah.
And for some reason, a lot of times I see that leaders kind of like lose sight of that.
Yeah.
And I think it's because people think about like a kind of more managerial perspective. But if you're in the business of teaching and
Hmm.
learning, then everybody in the building should be teachers and learners. And that includes the person who's in a leadership position. So I think it's, and the interesting thing is when I'm in my classes, a lot of times folks will say, duh, I know how to do this, right? Because I was a teacher for 15 years. So I
Exactly. Yeah.
know that I should have the objectives up and I know that we should be thinking about, and I know I should have an exit ticket so I can know what I missed this time that I need to pick up on last time. So I think my big advice is not like a concrete thing, but it's to invite leaders to think of themselves as teachers.
Yeah. And I have to say on my own work, I'd say that's one of the biggest gaps of effectiveness with leaders, where leaders kind of forget those foundational, like you need to differentiate for the different learning needs of your teachers instead of doing a
Yeah.
one and done, one size fits all PD.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, I guess
Oh
so, right?
yeah.
And then we need
Right.
to help. So then there's adult learning, right? There's
Yeah.
andragogy instead of pedagogy, right? Like there is an actual study of how adults learn, but there's beautiful crossovers where it's like differentiate for
Yeah.
the different learners in your classroom.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I love that you said that. That's so important.
I think there's another chapter that I was thinking of too, that one that Constance Daw and Fanny Martinez and I were writing about. And one of the principles in that chapter really like she was struggling with some of this, where she was trying to invite families to be part of the conversation, but the teachers um, were not used to that, right? That there hadn't been a context to enable that kind of thing. And so,
Mhm.
she when she said, like, well, let's reshape our whatever it is curriculum night so that we're learning from families. She said that there's a great story where she's like they just all were clustered over in the corner
Mhm.
and didn't want to like talk to the families, and they were kind of scared because it was such a different way of interacting. And so, I think this kind of relates to some of the work that you do, Becca, around sort of, she's like, well, we need to figure out how to create this more humanizing environment
Yes.
where teachers aren't scared of parents, parents aren't scared of teachers,
Yes.
and that they can actually develop a different kind of relationship with each other. And sometimes it starts so simply by asking families, like, what do you dream for your child? What do you hope for them? And just having some conversations about what have your past experiences been in school and with teachers, and what do you wish that would look like? And starting a conversation instead of starting from here's what we want your kid to do this year, or this is what I want to do as your child's teacher or principal, and asking questions.
Yes.
And I think that starting from a kind of more of an inquiry stance, and as I know, very much consistent with a kind of coaching, and
Hmm.
really thinking about asking questions
Hmm.
and starting from the questions around what young people are experiencing and what they're hoping, what
Hmm.
families are experiencing, and what they're hoping becomes a really powerful move. And then also with teachers, coaching them to be able to ask those questions and to develop a different kind of relationship and a more humanizing environment. And so the kind of theory of change being, if teachers can begin to experience that themselves, then
Yes.
it becomes a different game for them to be able to enact that with other adults and with young people themselves.
I love that you said that. And I actually want to share. I was running a PD for a bunch of brand new coaches, a room full of them. And I was like, oh, look at you guys. You're all so new. And I actually don't often get to work with brand new. I mean, they're like, what is this thing called coaching? And one of them said, how do I build a relationship with someone that's different than me? or like very different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, this is a great question, right? Because I think a lot of times in schools, we tend to bond over things that we're similar over. Like my kid, what'd you do over the weekend? Well, I went to soccer practice with my teenager. Oh, me too. Right. And I'm like, look, I don't know. I don't have kids. I'm not going to bond with you over that.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the things I've actually started to say a lot is connection is the shortest distance to coachability. And right, because I live in the world of coaching, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
think that extends to a lot of things, right? Connection is the
Mm-hmm.
shortest distance to like learning, and it's like if someone is stuck, connection is the quickest way to have learning happen, right?
Yeah.
And going back to that question of how do I build a relationship with someone that's different than me? And one of the first skill that I teach coaches is how to listen
Mhm.
well, right? And I have people
Right.
come to me after my workshops and they're like, I thought I was a good listener, but then I learned I
Exactly.
wasn't.
Yeah.
I was
We all
listening
think
to
we're good
respond
listeners.
instead of listening to understand. It is a
Yeah.
skill that we have to learn because fundamentally human beings are terrible listeners. We don't
Mm-hmm.
listen to the words people are saying. We're listening to our thoughts about what they're saying, right? And so we actually have to be taught intentionally how to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, if I can actually hear the words you are saying, not my opinions about them, I can
Mm-hmm.
ask different questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first skill I teach is listening. And then I teach the skill of asking questions because
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally we are going to ask different questions if we are only listening to our opinions about what people are saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, one of the lessons that cuts across every chapter in the book, and one of the things that, we came to realize as we analyzed the data and put together these stories is that equity leadership requires really, like, what do I say, coloring outside the lines and doing
Mm,
things that are different than the typical scripts that you would have, whether that's connecting with somebody who you wouldn't typically connect with,
hmm
to choosing a text that you wouldn't text, or using a form of assessment that you usually wouldn't use. Every every story in the book is about people who decided to do something that their system, that their school district, that their system, that the schools that they worked in did not necessarily view as something that you would or should do. So
hmm
everybody did something different. People did something different in the pursuit of, equity and justice for the children that were in front of them. And so, yeah, like if someone's not a listener, then that listening piece becomes important. I happen to work with a lot of folks, some folks who listen and they don't really say anything.
hmm
And for them, I'm going to give them something. You got to speak up, right? How do we create,
Yeah.
how do we create the conditions where
Yeah.
we get to hear what you have to say?
Yes.
And sometimes that might be a parent, right? Where the
Mm,
parents are used to coming and they're sitting. You can create the conditions where the parents have opportunities to talk, or students have opportunities to talk and share. And people who typically would talk and share have the opportunities to listen. And you hear me using this language specifically about opportunities because the opportunity to listen is an opportunity that
Yes.
can really fundamentally reshape how people relate to one another. And so I think I just wanted to just underscore that for all of the different people, the different stakeholders talking, students, parents, like really, it's important. And I would encourage people to think about what are you going to do that's going to color outside of the lines of what is the norm of what you would
mhm,
normally do. And that includes like students, like what are you going to do differently? Right. So right now I've been telling my daughter, she's been talking about, the things at the school that she wants to change. I'm like, y'all don't have a strong student voice group, right? That's
mhm,
something that you can do. It's not what people expect you to do.
mm,
It's not
yeah.
what the administration and teachers expect or cultivate, but doesn't mean you can't pursue it and you can't do it. So everybody that are a part of a school community or a system, the way that you disrupt the inequities in that system is to color outside the lines.
Yeah, I think like related to that is just sort of like I think sometimes there's a tendency to kind of wait for the mandate to get handed down or to get changed or for the person in a particular role, for the superintendent or the school board member to say it's okay or to give you permission or for you to get a title. that has a particular thing in it, and that, that's across that part of that coloring outside the line is no matter who you are, not waiting to be given permission or a formal charge to leave change. That is going to take all of us, especially in this moment, in all of the roles that we're in, to actually make change. And we have to move collectively in this moment as well. That if we are, even if we do have that formal role, this is the context and the conditions right now at the national level, and certainly in many states, is it's going to shut it down right away. And actually, I was just thinking about, Teresa Lance's title of her book is something about that it's a marathon and not a
Yes.
sprint.
Yes.
Yes.
Marathons, not sprints.
Yeah,
Institutionalizing
Yes.
equity through organizational learning.
there we go.
I
Yeah.
grabbed the book. So,
So we gotta move collectively. We gotta move at the level of like the organization, and we
Mhm.
can't wait to be given permission because there's no hero on high that's going to come in and save the day for us. We each need to take that up in whatever small ways, and that's first step. I'm thinking about Dakota's example with his daughter. Like my kids are also they're pushing back on certain kinds of policies. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but one of my kids there's a policy going on right now about that they can't carry their backpacks from class to class. They're in middle school. They're supposed to go back to their locker each period and put their backpacks in there. And it's turned into this huge thing. But I was just thinking about what are the kids doing, right? They're mobilizing. They're doing the kinds of things that we see adults doing in other spaces as well. They've got a petition going, but they're also being really creative. So they say that you can't use a backpack. Their kids coming in with garbage bags. Their kids coming in with like actual trash cans.
Mhm.
There's a kid who's carrying around an Xbox container so
Mhm.
with all of his stuff in it. So there's also something to be said about being really creative. Um, and that there's a kind of in that humanizing space, especially as night has fallen, that our creativity
Mhm.
and even our ability to like center joy and humor even in these really very at times of attack,
Mhm.
those become moments of possibility for
Mhm. Yeah.
creating that
Yeah.
change.
Yeah, I love it. And I actually I totally forgot that I work with this incredible organization in Jacksonville that and I work directly with these teacher leaders and some of them are instructional coaches, but most of them don't have any positional power, right? So we're talking about giving people personal power, right? The
Right.
ability to influence others versus
That's
positional
right.
power, right? It's my role that
Mhm.
gives me power. So I work with a bunch of people that don't have positional power and I teach them leadership skills to bring equity work to their schools from the ground up, from their classroom. And the first thing we talk about is how do we build trust and how do we listen to people? And then we build on that, right? So we have to feel like we're in a safe space to help each other, right? To give and receive feedback from each other. And then we go from there, and magic transformation happens between these interactions because people feel supported and connected to each other. And like outcomes dramatically change in classrooms from peer interactions. And so
Mm,
it's totally possible for this to
yes.
happen.
For sure. I think the one of my other research projects too is just sort of really seeing what happens when we think more intergenerationally. So I
Mhm.
think sometimes we have a tendency to kind of split off like, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Becca, right? Like here's what's happening for the adults and that's very different and distinct, and here's what's happening for the young people and we're going to approach that really differently. And recognizing that actually if we think more broadly about education,
Mhm. Yeah.
that that's happening all the time, right?
Mhm.
Schooling is a significant and important part of education, but it's not the same as the education that's happening all the time. And especially in community context, education is happening intergenerationally. So, what would happen if we actually shifted and really thought about, like, as adults, we're constantly needing to be in a learning relationship with each other as adults, but also with young people, and that we think about schooling as a context to cultivate intergenerational learning.
Yeah.
It shifts the kind of conversation about what we're supposed to be doing as adults in
Yeah.
schools.
Yeah. Looking at school as a context, like, oh, this is the way we do school. And sometimes what we accept as, oh, this is just the way we do school, actually is the context that's creating the very thing we don't want around. Right. It's like,
Exactly.
oh, okay, let's actually start to question that as well. So we have to wrap up. Oh my gosh, we've gone way over time, and I've loved this conversation. I would love, before we kind of sign off, I'd love you to share what's one thing that concretely school leaders and coaches can go into their schools tomorrow and do that increases the level or presences kind of more equity in their schools.
The one thing that I like to ask people to do is to talk to the person who you don't like or you don't like to talk to. Whether
That's
that's a
so good.
student, whether that's a student's parent, whether that's a colleague.
Oh, that's so powerful. And it's
It's
possible. It's possible. And it's possible
It's
to create
possible.
connection.
yeah.
And magic will come from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think mine was
And
going to
can
be
I just
very
add
similar to
one
that.
little thing?
Oh, go
I'll
ahead.
add one little thing to that. Typically, what I'll ask when I'm working with schools, I'll ask them to talk to, communicate with that person for a certain period of time, like 3 weeks straight. Go say hello 3 weeks for 3 weeks. If you have a student that you feel is particularly difficult, if you have a colleague who you have had a difficult relationship with, go speak to that colleague and talk to that colleague for 3 weeks every day. Go speak, go say hello, go say, I hope you had a good day. Do that for 3 weeks, just that practice, and watch how things change. So,
I love that.
Mine's similar. I ask folks in my systems leadership context to identify a student or a small group of students who we really have not done a good job of serving, and not try to go and talk to them to like try to fix something. And this relates to the listening, right? But to try to understand from their perspective what their experience of their learning is. And, like it often starts with like, oh, well, the test score is this or the behavior this. No, no, no. Like get in their shoes, get in their head a little bit. Like, how do they experience their day? So I've had folks who like are, like they maybe try to like go and have lunch with a kiddo. Or a small group of kids. And it takes, like Dakota said, it takes time because they're not going to open up all of a sudden and just tell you stuff. But walk alongside them. So, actually spend a little time and walk alongside them. Go with them to their class. I have somebody who went on the bus with a kiddo, and walk alongside a couple of those kids who we've done a really poor job of serving over a small amount of time and go deep and really try to understand how they're experiencing their schooling, and that will reshape your understanding of our system in really profound ways.
I love it. Thank you so much for both of you being here, sharing your expertise. I'm excited to get this book into people's hands. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the
Woo.
title. I will put yay, we all have it. I'll put the link to purchase in the show notes so folks can grab it. And if you both would love to share, be willing to share quickly, where can people find out more about you and your work and what you do?
You can find me on my website, annishimaru.com. Sometimes I'm lurking around on Instagram and LinkedIn, but mostly you can find out about me on my website.
Okay,
yep.
perfect.
Same here. You can find me at decoteauirby.com. You can also sign up for my newsletter there. I do send out newsletters with updates and things that I'm up to, whether it's organizing baseball tournaments or doing a book talk. So please sign up for my newsletter. And I'm also on social media at Decoteau Irby, and my IG is Dakota Black.
Perfect. We'll put all of that in the show notes as well, so folks can just click it and get to you quickly. So thank you again so much for being here, both of you.
Yep.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for having us.